Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game. It's Friday, so John and I are here to talk about another game that we've probably played a lot, right, over the years. It's kind of old at this point, relatively, but still considered in modern board games. And it is a social deduction game for 5 to 10 players that plays in about 30 minutes or longer, depending on how intense you are with this game. And so today we are talking about the Resistance. The Resistance. And so the Resistance is a social deduction game, meaning you are trying to figure out kind of who the other players are, their goals, and there is bluffing in it. Basically, you have two teams, the Resistance versus the Corporation or the Spies, and you're going on missions each round, sending a certain number of people, and then they'll vote on whether the mission succeeds or fails. And based on those results, you're trying to deduce over time who is actually on your team. If you're Resistance, who's a Resistance? If you're a Spy, well, you would know who's on your team. And so it's kind of to see which team can reach 3 out of 5 wins first, either 3 successful missions or 3 failed missions. And all along that, you want to try to deduce who's on your team, so you know who to send on the missions. It is kind of the next step, I would say, in the line of games like Mafia, a lot of people know, or Werewolf. And so there's going to be a lot of comparison to those games, I think, when we're talking about it tonight. But okay, so with that little bit, let's just get into it. John, your thoughts on the Resistance?
Yeah, let's see. I'm trying to think back to the first time I ever played Resistance. So I remember the first times I played Mafia and games like Mafia and stuff in the past. I used to play it in my Boy Scout troop. All you needed was a pack of cards, right? And it was just something you could just play real quick. Personally got tired of playing the game real fast because I always got killed first in Mafia. For
Because
some reason, I was
John
either the target
John
of the
talks a lot,
Mafia or I was awake
so
every first morning, and it didn't matter. So I ended up just playing Narrator all the time.
you
That
try
was
to silence the guy who talks so much.
I like to think it's because I was just so good at it.
Of course, of course.
No one could trust me, good or bad. But yeah, Resistance. I think the first time I played was actually with you and a few of our friends in Berkeley. It's probably the first time I actually
at
played
the
Resistance specific. We were at one of our friends' place,
mm-hmm.
and we had some. I think there was a couple of people visiting from your church group as well, Peter and
Mm-hmm.
Erica and a couple others. I think shout outs to them. Maybe they'll
And
be
that was maybe when Peter brought it. I don't think I had it yet, and his was a even smaller box. So this is the second edition. There's been a third edition. That's the one you'll find now with slightly different art, but still the same size and components. First edition was like smaller, and which was pretty cool actually, that it was so small.
Yeah, and yeah, I think playing it in my first impressions when I thought back on that time was like it definitely added a lot of things that if you have like if you're used to playing Mafia and things, like it definitely added a lot of elements to it that made it not as frustrating as Mafia can be sometimes, especially if you get killed early on in Mafia. You're pretty much just out of the game and there's pretty much nothing you can do. If you're killed quickly or killed early from random choice. And I think that's one of the things that when I first played Resistance I really appreciated about the game is the fact that you could keep playing even it took time, and it wasn't something that early on in the game someone gets ousted immediately or quickly, and then you're just kind of like, I don't really get to play anymore because of happenstance, choice selection, or whatever. And so I definitely had great experiences with Resistance with lots of different groups. You can play it with tons of different types of people. You don't really need to know how to play board games of any kind, because this game is, as we were mentioning, social deduction. It's a lot more about your interactions with other players and how you speak about what's going on in the game itself. And there are components and there's things that you need to talk about as the turns are progressing. But one thing I will say is this is kind of a funny point, or an interesting point about Resistance, is the box art or the box thing, as Ben mentioned, is that it's a 30-minute game. I think on average, most of the games that I've ever played of Resistance, Avalon is something separate, of the Resistance, it typically runs on average at least 1 hour, if not longer. So I think Ben was mentioning, depending on the group of people you play with. I think that's one of the things that I found very surprising about this game, is just how long it can take and how draining it can be when you play this game. So, and Ben is showing components of the game.
Yeah, I just wanted to show some of that while you're talking. Yeah, it is true that it can take longer, and I do feel that it can be kind of draining, because which is interesting, because it's draining. I think because the draining part comes from one of the big innovations of the game, right? Which I think is the fact that you mentioned that you aren't eliminated from the game, right? I remember playing like Mafia back in high school in youth group randomly at times, like on retreats and stuff. And if you're playing with a group of like 20, 30 people and you get eliminated, like just randomly killed, right, in Mafia, then you're just sitting there listening to everyone, which can be entertaining. Like when in high school, you're like, oh yeah, like you see that person bluffing, or you try to read other people. But the more you have to sit through that, the more boring that gets, And so I think one of the genius, like game-changing things that Resistance did is it made that social deduction experience of Mafia into one where you aren't eliminated. You're always in the game. Because like I mentioned, you're going on missions. And so there's like the board showing the number of missions, like 5 missions for a whole game at most. Mm-hmm. And the boards that come with the game just have different sizes depending on the number of players you're playing with. So you're just going on those missions, and then based on how people are voting and how you're voting, that'll change the result of the mission, success or fail, but you're still in the game. There's no one to like kick you out of the game. And so that's ingenious, but then also brings in that possibility of being draining, because you always have to stay in the game. Like, I snuck past these people this mission, so I still gotta like keep up my bluffing, So.
And kind of talking to that point of the draining and kind of how a little bit of the game itself too is one of the things about this game too is like in Mafia, it's purely based on like talking, right? Pretty much the entire game is just based on how does somebody kind of discuss the situation, honestly, kind of how eloquent people are just based on charisma a lot of the time. But in this game, it's a little different because you get a little more information. So as we were mentioning, right, there are missions that you go on. So there's actually 2 parts to the game, right? There's the first part, which is even deciding who is going to be on the mission in the first place. And there's one of the players is the leader, and they will choose a certain amount of people. And I think as Ben was showing the board, it'll show the number of people, the number of agents that need to go on that mission. So it's 3, 4, 5, less players, it's like 2, 3, 4, or something like that. And so you're basically selecting how many people are going to be on that mission, and you have to get, I believe, a majority consensus for people to go on the mission. Right, so you need a majority consensus of the players, all of the players, to agree to that set of players to go. Then you get the second part, which is also really interesting, because the first part you can kind of see whether people are like, yes, I want these people to go on the mission, or no, I don't. But then the second part is the part where we see whether or not the mission passes or fails, which is where you have these success and fail cards. So all of the agents are passed out cards. both of them, one or the other, and those agents will then choose the success or the fail cards, and then as long as one fail shows up at any point, the mission is automatically a loss, or it basically won by the spies, won by the corporation. And that is where a lot of the deduction comes into the game at that point. When the players are turning in those cards, success fail, obviously it's shuffled, so you shouldn't know which player is putting down a success or fail, because obviously if you knew that, then where's the social deduction in the game? But that's where a lot of the discussions and the stuff happens at that point, because in games like Mafia, you don't really have, other than the detective role to get information, there's no real other roles that give you information in base Mafia, right? But in Resistance, this is material and information that's shared to everybody, and you get to see people's voting patterns, you get to see whether or not there are successes, how many successes there are in mission, or failures. Sometimes you have two failures that happen at the same time on the same mission, which is a little surprising when you're not a good guy.
because as you mentioned, like having those success or fail shuffled together, right? The ones that people choose. And so once it's revealed, I usually like revealing it in like a dramatic way, like one card at a time. And then you'll see, like, you'll know, like, if 3 people were sent on this mission, one of these 3 put in that fail. So that's how you like start deducing. And then you can see like next time, like, oh, 4 people went, there's another fail. That means one of these 4. Oh, but that person was on the previous mission. Is it them? And I think that's like the real game part to it, because I think with Mafia, there is often that, like, especially in the beginning and maybe like for the first half of it, there's very much like that just randomness, right? It's like at night, who does Mafia kill? Well, I don't know, that person was talking earlier, so let's just kill him first. Or like I'm angry at that person in real life, so I'm just gonna choose him in this game. It's just like random, there's not like really any reason. And then when people wake up and start deducing, there's a lot of complaints of like, I feel like I just have to accuse someone, and that's like really random sometimes too. And it's like, why are you accusing me? I did absolutely nothing, where in this game,
you breathed wrong.
Yeah, I heard you breathe during the night. But it's like in this one, there's, like you said, like that material information that something actually happened, and it involves certain people. So then you start with that. So that's like the real game part, I think, that this adds to the social deduction.
Yeah.
And so aside from, I think those are the 2 big points I think of that make this game like amazing. Like it was one of the early games for me when getting into board games, and it's obviously very specifically that social deduction kind of game, so it filled that slot for me. And I think since it, like, that's when games have been trying to do more of like non-player elimination games, because they know it's annoying to just like get kicked out and not be able to actually play anymore. But then also, as you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Avalon. So there is the Resistance Avalon, which is a different version of the game, but the base game is still the same. It's still played the same, but it just adds like another kind of module you can play with. Mm-hmm. And so in the base Resistance, there's a module, I don't remember what this is called, but there are these like stacks of cards. I don't know if they're like mission cards, or I forgot, there was a certain name for them. But it's basically a mechanic that you can add on top of to what we described, right? Where the leader each round gets to draw like one of these and then do what it says. And it could be like some way for the leader that round to, learn of another player's allegiance or their identity, stuff like that. And so that's the module in the base Resistance game, which actually I've maybe only played with once or twice ever. I don't know if you've played with it more.
With Resistance's rules, not really. I haven't really played with many of the specials, but as we were mentioning, the Resistance Avalon, it's medieval themed, right? King Arthur's court. But the components of the game are pretty much the exact same as Resistance. It just adds in, I think, a number of the modules and certain roles that also lend to additional potential win or loss criteria into the game, right? Because it adds, in Resistance Avalon, it adds like Merlin role, which is kind of like the detective. There's added, like an assassin role. There's I forget the others.
So my base resistance has these
Which
promo
has
cards.
those.
So the one you get won't have this, but this is why I also don't have a copy of Avalon anymore. Right, I didn't need to keep both, especially when like the core mechanic added to Avalon, I have the promos for.
Exactly.
But yeah, and so like as you mentioned, like I think Avalon adding those was really cool. I think that module was easier to do, easier to learn than the one that I just showed in the base resistance game. This one was a little confusing, like of when to draw it, who gets to play it, or how do you play these cards. But then in Avalon, just having roles that have special abilities, basically, right? Like the base ones, like you mentioned, Merlin and Assassin, like Merlin being able to know who the assassins are, but then I mean who the spies are, but then potentially if he gets chosen in the end or found out that he's Merlin, the resistance still loses.
Yeah.
Like that I think is easy to incorporate and very smart. Like it plays really well, because then obviously when we like teach people this game, right, like Avalon with Merlin in the assassin, people always ask like, oh, if Merlin knows, why can't he just say anything he wants? Like tell the resistance like, oh yeah, don't send those guys on the mission because they're the spies. But it's because of that other rule that if Merlin is found out at the end, even if the resistance we're gonna win, they lose. And I think that's really smart.
Yeah, and to me, like personally, I've actually played Avalon. I think more the Resistance Avalon more than I played the base Resistance alone. I personally have found that having roles, having player powers, and I think the reason why it feels like that one for me has become a more popular version, or at least a more popular module, is because again, it just gives more material and it gives more information for players to play around with, right? So it adds a layer of complexity, but it's still the same base game, and you're still trying to deduce, you're still trying to figure things out, and it doesn't take away from the core of the game or confuse the core of the game into something that's, you know, beyond what it was before. So it's one of those really nice add-ons into the game itself, and then it kind of gives it a little bit more of the old school mafia kind of feel, because now you have specific and particular roles, which base the resistance, you don't really have that. Everyone is the same, right? Every player is the same player, right? So
and so I mean, from my experience, I would say that I've played base resistance itself a lot, and that's the one that I'd be okay with playing, but because that I think can already be intense trying to figure things out, right? Like deducing, but then also the social aspect to it. So for me, let me see if I can pull up the BGG page. Let's see. So for me, this rating is from probably actually years ago though, so I haven't updated this for a long time. My rating is an 8, and I would say 8 or even 8.5 at this point. Actually, even after like not playing for years, the rating might go up, just because I think it was such a groundbreaking kind of game, not just for social deduction, but over the years, like any game that brought in social deduction, I think could learn from resistance of either the, not having player elimination, or to like the Avalon kind of roles you mentioned, like Merlin knowing extra information. I think those are things that have been incorporated in other games. So that's really kind of big on resistance part for introducing those, I think.
Yeah, and I think my rating would probably be similar. Again, I think if we're combining resistance with the Resistance Avalon module, it is a standalone game. I think we're saying module, but the Resistance Avalon is a separate board game that you buy. I would probably also have it at an 8.5 as well, or probably 8 more than 8.5. I just think they're really solid games. It is one of the best social deduction games that you can introduce to people. If people like to play Mafia, or I know they're like really into Mafia or Werewolf and those types of games, then I'm like, well, if you haven't tried the Resistance or the Resistance Avalon, you might actually like these ones more than those again, mainly because of what we've discussed before, of the fact that you lose the ability for, or like the fact that people can be eliminated and not play the game, right? And they, as you were saying, like that's just never a fun thing, right? When you're basically told, sorry, you can't play anymore, while everyone else is still playing. It's kind of I'm calling out all those people who did that to me. All those are
And I guess at this point, I would also just mention, I think at least two of the kind of depths, like negative points to the resistance that I can think of, but I think they're both small. One is that you mentioned in the very beginning of, Mafia, Werewolf, that kind of game can be played with poker cards, right? Like you assign the role to just the card, the certain face cards, and you deal those out. So with resistance, I guess you technically could do that too if you really wanted to. And I remember people mentioning that a long time ago of like, oh, we can just make the resistance ourselves, So from my perspective, one, I would want to support the board game industry by buying the game. It's probably like $20 retail, I think that's how much it is. Yeah, maybe 25. And so it's not too expensive. But then for me, like being someone who cares about theme, having components that actually like, have art on them versus just abstract poker card suits, remember what they are. Like I like having the art, the actual board there to help you keep track of the rounds. That actually is a little more important, I think, having that board to know how many people send on a mission. So that might be a little more necessary to have the actual resistance game for. But I think that's a small thing. You could, like I mentioned, technically make a copy. But the other small thing I think of is those games, Mafia, Werewolf, can play like a ton of people, right? Where Resistance is obviously designed and balanced for 5 to 10 people, right? And like the different sides of the player board changes the number of people who's going on missions based on how many people are playing. So there is like balance that went into figuring out a game that plays that number of players. And I think that's a even smaller complaint that I can think of, because for me, I don't get like 20 people together for board games anymore, Like that was very much like high school youth group. You do gather like every weekend with this group of people. But then now, like when playing board games, like, yeah, if we can get up to 10 people, which is, I think, uncommon, like, sure. I mean, this does cover the higher range of people I would have over. But aside from that, then I don't really need to play Mafia just because it can fit more than 10 people.
Yeah, and I think on that note, I think the negative side, and again, I don't think there's extreme negatives. I think it's more of like this game is heavily dependent on who you play with, right? But this is exactly the style of the game. It's a party game, it's a social game. So the fun that you get out of this type of game is kind of dependent on the people that you're playing with. And that's how you really get a lot of enjoyment. So I think one of the things we had mentioned is like, I think the first time I played this game is I think it ended up being like a 2.5 hour game in total. That's because a couple of players, myself and our friend, like to debate and like to discuss a lot of what is going on and trying.
Peter? Is it Peter?
Yeah, it was Peter.
Yeah, calling you out,
we
Peter.
spent like an hour on the final round just going back and forth about every single action in the entire game. So that can happen in the game. Some people enjoy it. Others we could all kind of see in that group were like, okay, why are these guys still going on? But whatever. And then I've also played with my family, and my family is very much of the opposite of the let's just get through games and not take it super seriously, and we will actually hit the 20-30 minute marks per game session. But again, it's heavily dependent on the people that you're playing with. In terms of like, if people are really into the game, I think you'll have a great time with the game, right? Because then people are really taking it seriously. They really want to get into it. So that's great. But then if you have people who maybe aren't into the game or not really trying to get into the game, you definitely lose a lot of you might lose some of the magic of the game because people maybe just aren't getting into the game. So there is some criticism on that side.
But I would like point out
Game
that,
itself, but more of its even ability.
I mean, I would point out that, like, I mean, hopefully, I mean, you don't get the sense that from what John's saying, like, that the game is like a long debate, though, you know? Like, I think the fact that it does split it up into those missions, each round is a mission, like, there's quite often, like, these, oh my gosh, moments, like, every round, just because of how the mission ended up, you know? Like, just like on one round, if the mission fails, you're all like, what just happened? Like, I thought that was a safe team, you know, like that happens quite often throughout the game. So it's not just like a like quietly stare at each other and debate until you reach the end of the game, you know. It's like, it's exciting, it's like ups and downs a lot throughout it. So yeah, so overall, I mean, I think I would probably agree with you. I would be giving it an 8 in the long run, just solid game. I don't get it played that much because, again, like you mentioned, it depends on the people you're playing with. But yeah, if there is a group that enjoys playing it, especially, like, I mean, I like acting, you know, like the bluffing. I like doing that. I remember, I think the way Peter taught us maybe was like before we even started the game, it's like, okay, let's go around and say who we are. Do you remember
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
And
yeah.
then you just make up your identity. It's so funny. It's like, I am Smith. I'm part of the resistance because they killed my wife. And it's like, dang, okay, you're gonna be dark about this one.
He was a spy in the end. No.
That-
Liar.
that's like a little tip to you guys. If you guys play Resistance, it's a fun little thing to add. Just like
Mm-hmm.
make up an identity for that game. I think it's funny. But yeah, so I like the acting, bluffing, no player elimination, ups and downs of the missions. So really solid 8 from me.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to add about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, if you haven't played a social deduction game before, or if really your only experience is Mafia, like, definitely give this a go. It's a great game. You can find a group of people, again, up to 5, or at least 5, and up to 10. My personal preference in playing this game is usually about, I believe, 8 people.
Mm.
7 or 8 is, I think, to me, is the most optimal. I think 10 is a lot to play with. It just kind of drags on sometimes with the amount of people you have to wait for. 5 can get a little bit too quick in the game. It's a little bit too fast. You kind of get used to the people that you're playing with. So 7 to 8, to me personally, I enjoy the most as like the most balanced of this game. You can still play with the number 5 to 10, you know, of course. But I think that's where I found the most enjoyment in playing this game. And yeah, like, I would rank this, yeah, as I said before, the 8. I think there's other social deduction games that we've played since then. Maybe we'll talk about those too in the future. But I definitely think that, I think a lot of the other games we've already talked about, this was definitely a trendsetter in this style, in this aspect of playing these types of games.
So yeah, so thanks for watching, guys. If this was helpful, hope you'll share this video. We've been talking about the Resistance. Hope you'll check it out. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Viva la resistance!
The Resistance!